2 weeks ago, we published the first episode of a new video series on the topic of Bitcoin and ecology. We explained in the first installment that much of the criticism of Bitcoin's environmental impact is mostly unfounded and often stems from all sorts of shortcuts and extrapolations that are completely erroneous and ultimately demonstrate a total lack of understanding of the subject. Unfortunately, most people would stop there, stay on the surface, and stick to this thin layer of misinformation shared in the media in search of sensationalism. However, if you dig a little deeper, you'll soon realize that the connection between Bitcoin and ecology is much more complex than it first appears. The question of Bitcoin's environmental impact obviously forces us to think about the utility of this new technology. As we said in the first episode, Bitcoin is trying to address some extremely important monetary issues, and to do so, the network uses a tiny fraction of the world's electrical energy. When you compare the efficiency of Satoshi Nakamoto's invention to the existing alternatives, the current banking system or the precious metals industry, you realize that Bitcoin is not that bad. Quite the contrary. And let us not forget that the consumption is not pollution. We've seen that miners use a lot of energy that would otherwise be wasted or lost, and that about 50% of the electricity that powers the Bitcoin network is apparently already green. This first video had the merit of setting the record straight and of challenging a number of preconceived notions. Now, we could go a little further in the analysis. Beyond not being as bad for the environment as some people claim, Bitcoin could, in the end, if you think about it, actually be beneficial to the ecological cause and facilitate the energy transition. And yes, today, we are going against the grain of what's being said in the mainstream press, and we take it on. Bitcoin isn't perfect, of course, but it's a lot greener than you think. And that's what we're going to discuss in this video. Come on, let's go. In my opinion, most people don't realize the complexity that lies behind an electrical network. Synchronization, inertia, or balancing of the electrical network are some of the existing problems. Like a magician, you flick the switch and the room lights up, and it seems perfectly normal. But behind the scenes, engineers work tirelessly to juggle the grid's energy supply and demand, and make sure everyone can turn on their TVs, use the internet, and even heat with electric heaters. You should know that our network is meshed to respond to consumption peaks. If this were not the case, in winter you would have to choose between your electric radiator and your television set. In France, there is no shortage of electricity, just the right amount at the right time. The production potential of our infrastructure is therefore sometimes untapped and sometimes under strain. There are two types of surplus to consider in understanding this problem. First, surplus production. This is energy that you are obliged to produce and that you don't know what to do with. A simple example, when the wind blows, the wind turbines turn and produce electricity, and you have to do something with that electricity. And unfortunately, when no one wants it, the price of electricity can be negative in the markets. Considering the fact that the wind blows globally at the same time in Europe, i.e. more in the winter and more at night, these surplus situations are not so anecdotal. And secondly, we have power surpluses. For example, nuclear power plants and thermal power plants, i.e. gas, oil, coal, are controllable. They can be turned on or off. A good part of the year, in summer for example, when we don't need to heat, the power plants are not working at their maximum potential. For a country like France, if you look at these two types of surplus, we have an energy surplus of about 20%. In other words, France has the capacity to produce 20% more energy. Bitcoin mining is not especially interesting for developed countries with this kind of surplus, because their power grids are already relatively efficient. For a mining machine to be profitable, it has to be running for a large part of the time. Depending on the initial investment, the operational cost of the plant, and of course the price of electricity, miners calculate a break-even point. Now, if we take as a reference point a utilization time of at least 50% in France, we do not have this type of overcapacity, or else only marginally. There are other more intelligent solutions for using these energy flexibilities. For those countries with a relatively developed network, the most efficient idea is to organize the large consumers, i.e. the industrialists, around these flexibilities. If you have noticed the energy pool logo on the previous diagrams, this is exactly what the company does. We know it very well since Richard is the fourth shareholder. But that's another topic. If you want to know more about this type of business, check out this video on Grand Angle Eco. Therefore, as we have seen, surpluses are relatively low in developed countries. Even if there are Western countries with large surpluses, like the US for example, where we saw a wave of miners coming in after the Chinese Communist Party's announcement about Bitcoin. But let's focus on the countries that do not yet benefit from a centralized electricity network. well meshed internally, but also externally with their foreign economic partner. In these still developing countries, there's a lot of unused energy production capacity, both renewable and non-renewable, which allows the mining industry to develop while providing very useful solutions to the local fabric. The key difference that needs to be understood between developing and Western countries is the nature of the investments in these energy production sites. Basically, when you build a hydroelectric dam or a gas-fired power plant in a developing country, you size the facility taking into account the development of demand over the next 20 years. So for 20 years, you have enormous spare capacity. And that's why mining gas in Kazakhstan is not an aberration despite the CO2 emissions. If you don't do it, you don't amortize the cost of the plant, and you end up causing supply shocks for the local people. So as much as mining coal or oil is highly criticizable, as much as for the rest, we have to be careful not to draw hasty conclusions, and rather see on the case-by-case basis according to the local situation. In these specific cases of oversized energy production sites in developing countries, crypto miners are perfect customers. Their machines can run 24/7, but can also be interrupted on demand when necessary. During a consumption peak by individuals, for example. This is called erasure. Since Bitcoin is a decentralized network, the interruption of mining operations from time to time at a particular site has no impact on the rest of the network. Users won't even notice. As we said in the first episode, miners act like energy scavengers who do not compete with the needs of the population. Bitcoin mining could help make these sites profitable by monetizing all the electricity produced, but not used by individuals during periods of low demand or excess production. Bitcoin would then be like an economic battery that monetizes unused energy. There are countless opportunities for companies that understand these issues, and we are just starting to see simple and concrete solutions. The company Easy Blockchain, for example, has started to deploy ready-to-use mining modules. You just plug them into the power supply at the back of your factory, and you're mining Bitcoin. A few months or years later, if the situation changes, these containers can disappear as quickly as they appeared. This flexibility completely changes the game when it comes to risk assessment. Bitcoin comes to cushion the financial risks of new energy projects. Basically, miners will always position themselves as the buyer of last resort. When you finally understand the place that Bitcoin could take in this industry, the implications are enormous. Of course, all of this reasoning is strongly linked to the price of Bitcoin, and thus to its adoption by more and more people. Imagine, for example, the impact this could have on rural electrification projects in Africa. At present, it is very difficult to find investors interested in this type of initiative because most of the time, these are isolated areas where local demand is low. And this does not justify the installation of a hydroelectric dam or geothermal site. In addition, it is often necessary to build everything, i.e. the power generation site, but also the distribution infrastructure. All these constraints put together, these projects are never financed because the business plan is simply not viable. In 2021, more than 700 million people still do not have access to electricity. Bitcoin could be a complete game changer. With mining, new power plants can start generating revenue from day one, without waiting for the plant to be connected to the rest of the grid. Plus, as we saw just before, mining can compensate for the lack of demand on the grid. In essence, Bitcoin could act as a buffer between peaks and valleys in consumption. Thanks to Satoshi Nakamoto's invention, a huge amount of clean energy, especially hydroelectric and geothermal, previously untapped due to unfavorable economic conditions, could be unlocked. This model is, for example, already a reality in Congo, and more particularly in the Virunga National Park. I have no doubt that in the coming months and years, we will hear more and more about initiatives like Virunga National Park. We've also seen El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, launch mining-related projects to better utilize his country's energy resources, specifically the geothermal energy of its volcanoes. Yes, you heard me right. El Salvador mines Bitcoin using volcanoes. Pretty cool, huh? This is another example of a fully renewable energy resource, previously untapped due to lack of funding, being put to good use through mining. In addition, the economic incentives inherent in Bitcoin mining help drive innovation as miners constantly seek to increase their profits by lowering their electricity costs. For this reason, some even believe that the mining industry, by providing economic incentives for research and development in the renewable energy sector, could ultimately accelerate the energy transition, in the same way that innovations developed in Formula One find their way into our cars a few years later. This powerful impetus that Bitcoin has given to the renewable energy could be reflected in our daily lives in a few years. But beware of extravagant fantasies about renewable energies, especially solar and wind power. I sometimes see articles explaining that we could develop these two types of renewable energy by using the surplus to mine Bitcoin or produce hydrogen. As I said, mining machines, to be profitable, have to run a good part of the time. But in the case of a wind turbine, the utilization rate is less than 16%, and solar is not much better, so it doesn't work. Moreover, as it is, the big serious miners manage to buy the kilowatt hour of electricity between 1.5 euro cents and 3 euro cents. This is a far cry from the production cost of a wind or solar kilowatt hour, which are more like 20 euro cents to 30 euro cents per kilowatt hour. As for green hydrogen, let's be honest, it's a mirage because it's one of the most expensive energy storage solutions at the moment, about 10 to 50 times more expensive than lithium batteries. These technologies are simply not ready. All these fanciful energy storage solutions today, such as the stacking of concrete blocks, are technically possible, but they stop when they look at their costs for full-scale projects. Some of these miracle energy storage solutions will surely exist in 50 years' time, such as nuclear fusion. But for the next few decades, we will have to make do with what we have. So we've seen how Bitcoin mining could facilitate the financing of energy projects, and thus possibly facilitate the transition to cleaner energy sources, especially hydroelectricity and geothermal energy. Now you should know that mining can also help reduce greenhouse gas emissions from certain industrial activities. The media rarely talks about that, does it? And yet, do you know what gas flaring is? So, as a reminder, or for more information, it is the combustion of natural gas that is released during the extraction of oil. We burn these gases to avoid as much as possible the emission of methane into the atmosphere. Gas, which you know, is 25 times more problematic for the climate than carbon dioxide. This methane flaring is a mandatory practice in most countries. Now you're probably wondering why producers aren't selling this gas back. Good question. Well, unfortunately, oil producers face significant challenges in capturing, storing, and transporting and distributing this gas to an eventual market. Most of the time, given the relatively small amounts of gas available, it's simply not economically feasible, and it's easier and cheaper to burn this valuable natural resource completely unproductively. Crypto mining is finally a viable alternative. Miners connect directly to existing infrastructure and turn that wasted energy into digital gold. For example, the company Crusoe has developed a patented system that will reduce methane emissions into the atmosphere by up to 98%. So, in addition to recovering natural gas, you could reduce the environmental impact of the extraction site. I honestly don't see how we could do better. Crusoe is one company among many, but the sector is developing rapidly. Many industrialists are realizing the potential that this represents from an ecological point of view, but especially economically. We could also talk about the reuse of the heat generated by the mining devices, the famous ASICs, for other uses. In Canada, for example, homes will be heated thanks to mining. You might say that this concept of heat reuse is not specific to Bitcoin. You could do the same thing with any data center. But the big difference with mining is that you don't need to ask anyone's permission. Anybody in the world can try their luck. No one will come and audit you. There's no accreditation required to start mining. That's the great strength of an open network. Initiatives are proliferating. We could also have mentioned, for example, the startup Wise Mining, which proposes to heat your home thanks to the heat generated by mining machines. Or the company Daymark, which tries to mine crypto with the electric cars of tomorrow. We know very well what causes climate change or biodiversity loss. The problem is that we don't do much about it. That may be a bit cynical, but the sad reality is that, in my opinion, if we rely only on people's ethics and morals, nothing will change. And we'll probably still be running on oil and coal in 2050. The transition to renewable energy will only happen if there is a strong economic interest. Bitcoin provides it, finally. Norway's Minister of Climate and Environment has understood this perfectly well. He owns Bitcoins and is a strong advocate of the transition to this new technology. In a country where the environment is a priority, this makes you think. On that note, see you soon for new videos. Ciao!